useEffect is not that terrible. I'm going to explain to you what is useEffect, why do we use it, why do we have to use it, and hopefully by the end of this video you're going to start understanding this React hook better and start using it with more confidence. And I feel like this is something that might help some people and as well as myself to understand this hook much better, especially after trying to teaching it to other people. So yeah. Now I have a fresh Vite application with React, and it reruns. It runs perfectly. It has the classic count system, and I want to add an API to this page. I want to add an API call, sorry, and I want to call the API and fetch the data and showcase it in the DOM. And also, I'm assuming that you already are familiar with the basic concepts of React, but I'm still also going to review some of the stuff that would make you understand the useEffect hook much better. So stick to it. Okay, let's pick this example of calling an API. I'm using this API for free. It's called jsonplaceholder.typecode.com. So I would say definitely check it out. So like first thought, like of a person who never used React or at least is a beginner React developer, would go that, well, I can just call the fetch, and I can just say fetch, and I can copy this line. I'm also using my mouse even though it's thin, so please excuse me. So these, and inside of that you would say that console log something like, so it's a fetch call, so it has to grab the results and it has to be async as well. I can do it here, and if I refresh the page, I can see that it fetches everything. So it fetches the items. Imagine that I have to also set the to-dos, sets to-dos, use the, and it has to have a type, right? So it has to have a type. I'm just going to define a quick type for it, as I already remember what the type is, and then render it. I already have the code, honestly. I'm just gonna copy paste this here, paste, format. Yeah, so if I refresh the page, yeah, I forgot to set the state. And I come here, just refresh the page quickly, and everything is fine, am I right? Like it shows everything, but the only issue I can see here is that my scroll bar is going crazy here. And that is because I'm setting this React state inside of this function without using anything, like without wrapping it in anything, and it's like refetching from this API every single time, because whenever a state in React updates, React always recalls this component to start updating it. So what happens is that, simpler terms, it means that when the first time a component in React initializes, it mounts, and then what happens is that it updates. So for example, in this case, I update the state, it goes to the update phase, and then once I, let's say, close this tab, is going to automatically unmount, or if I change the component to some other component, the existing component will be unmounted basically. But what is very interesting is that every single time in each phase of these 4 phases, React will always recall this component again. So it means that first time it calls this function, and then it reads all these states, and then it also reads the fetch, and then it returns this JSX, which I assume that you already know what JSX is. And it obviously would start comparing the result of this JSX with the real DOM, so because it has a virtual DOM which is also like very identical to this like real DOM, but it's not the same. So whenever that React wants to update, it first updates the virtual DOM, and then it starts comparing it to the real DOM, and then it would say, okay, these two are different, and it like starts to updating the real DOM. Yeah, but anyway, so what happens is that this fetch function keeps recalling every single time that any of these phases happen. So if I update a state, this happens. If I mount, this happens, and if it unmounts, it also happens. It's not a very efficient way, because now the user has to always run all of these network calls, and it's it's not very efficient. So what's the solution, you might say? And as you can see, my browser is also frozen.
2 hours later.
Okay, yeah, my browser got frozen 1 second, and it's not a good approach of doing this. So what React came up with is that, oh, okay, my browser actually died.
1 eternity later.
Okay, there you go, my browser is back. Sorry. So here I have this component that I want to call an API for. So basically, React started coming up with a solution called useEffect. And so what this useEffect does is that it's a hook that accepts a callback function, and it accepts a second argument as an array, and this array is basically the dependency array, as React likes to call it. And so what happens is that the first argument means that you're telling React that you want to run this callback every single time that update happens or mount happens, right? And then you have this array that's empty. What this array means is that it's saying that, hey, whatever that is in this array would be a dependency of this like useEffect callback. In simpler terms, it means that if I don't pass anything to this array, that means that this useEffect won't be ran twice. So if I call that function again, refresh to show you a fresh instance, yeah, see, it only runs once, but it runs twice. That's also confusing, which is because React would always run the component twice in the development phase, because it wants to check that everything is working properly and you're not doing something wrong as like a bad developer, basically. But yeah, just ignore that for now. The other thing is that, let's say that I pass count to this useEffect. So now I just changed the whole logic of this useEffect with adding this simple thing here. So what this means is that now I'm telling React that, hey, whenever that the count state updates, which is updated by me clicking this button, whenever this updates, please call this effect again. Please call this effect, or aka the callback function, again. So if I clear the console log, I hit the button again, and I can see it basically runs the useEffect again. I can show you with the console log. Refresh, hit this, fetching from the API, and returns the responses that the console log here. So if I do this multiple times, it's going to fetch every single time from the API. But if I remove this count, it's going to only run it once. And if I do this forever, it's just like not going to fetch again. because of the fact that there is nothing in this dependency array that would tell React that you have to call this callback function whenever this state like here got changed. So right now there are no states. Sometimes though, like this is very important, sometimes people tend to forget to pass this because they might say, oh, I mean, it's optional. Like even if you look at the useEffect signature, they look at this and say, oh, it's optional, so I shouldn't pass it, right? But the issue happens here is that the useEffect is going to be ran forever whenever you change a state. So if I comment this and if I don't change any states and I remove this, what happens is that it always runs the useEffect whenever that you update something. See, for example, here if I hit the count, it refetches from the API, which is not very nice because we as developers always want to have full control of what we're doing, really. So it's always best to pass it instead of saying, oh, it's just undefined. No, it should always be something because it should be explicit, right? Because you have to say, personally, I haven't seen any use case for not passing this and letting this whole thing to be ran every single time something updates. This is something I've never personally done. And even if I want to do that, I would pass the state of this to do, and it's explicitly saying that whenever that this set to do got updated, it's going to start recalling this callback function again. So it's explicit. There's no hidden paths, hidden things going on here. So yeah. And also, I think something that also confuses people is that why can you have multiple useEffects? Or like sometimes they ask that, oh, I didn't know you can have more than useEffects. I thought you only can have one useEffect and that's it. But no, that's not true. You can actually have two useEffects with different logics. For example, here I want to say different useEffect, and it also depends on the to-do state. So it means that like whenever this to-do state got updated, then call this function based on like whatever is inside of this dependency array, which in this case is the to-dos state. If I refresh, you can see that it has the different useEffects also printed as well as the fetch from API. I'm gonna quickly remove this so that my browser doesn't stuck. And also there is another interesting point is that if you set this array as empty, then that means that this effect does not want to run after every single change. It only runs once after you mount the component. If I refresh the page, I should see this exactly. So it fetches from the API twice because React always runs everything twice because it wants to test if the things you're writing are correct. And so if they're correct, then it's fine. But if you miss something or if you make a mistake that React doesn't like, it's going to bite you over here in the console and saying that, oh, hey, like you're not following the rules. So that's the reason. But yeah, if I change this count state, it's not going to affect these useEffects anymore because the dependency arrays are empty. But now if I set this dependency array as, if I set this dependency array as count, it's going to change a bit. It's going to let me fetch from the API every single time the count updates. So it can be handy sometimes if you want to refetch from the API when a state changes. So that's that. You can also have multiple things because it's an array, right? So you can have to-dos and counts, which is not like recommended because in this case it's going to like run forever. So you have to be careful what you pass. You should always be careful of what kind of logic you have here before deciding to add a state in the dependency array. So in this case, I'm always calling the set to-dos instead of this logic, and I'm also saying that it also depends on the to-do state, which means that it's gonna have a loop. So it's not nice. I'm gonna remove it. But I'm going to have it here because there are no logics here that are blocking me from rerunning this effect every single time that the to-dos updates, because it's just like it won't like set any other states, right? So I hope like those parts are not very confusing. And also I can have another, if I want to have another use effect, I also can do that. So here I can also have another one. And as a rule of thumb, you should always wrap every single logic that you have inside of a use effect unless you exactly know what you're doing and you're not working with the React states and you're doing something on your own that's not dependent and it's not very cost effective to put it in the use effects and not always run it. I would say in that case just put something else. Let's say, for example, I have constant variable here as object. It's an object, and I want to, let's say I want to assign this object to some arbitrary values, for example like test object, and I just want to copy it like as a reference. I just want to copy the reference to this new object, and I'm going to use this object throughout my whole app. Then that makes sense. First of all, it's a read-only object, so I say like as const. And second of all, I'm not really performing like any logic that's super complicated for React to handle every single time it updates. But as a rule of thumb, it's always better to have external stuff, for example connecting to WebSockets or connecting to an external API like this case here, which by the way you can also use the IIFE syntax, which is the immediately invoked function. IIFE or IIFC, I don't know. IIFC, I think. And so it's really looking like this. Wait. Yeah, so basically you can also do this. But the only issue now is that you can't handle the errors easily, whereas before I could just pass the catch function and say, whereas here, if it suddenly starts to throw an exception, it's going to propagate to the whole component, which is not really nice, which means I have to use try catch, which I don't appreciate that much. It's not very safe, like because of the error handling aspects of it. I think that wraps up the whole use effect things. As you can see, I have all of this here, and if I fetch, because it's like dependent on the count, it's going to re-render. And another thing that's really important is that sometimes ESLint is going to get mad at you for using a state inside of this use effect, but you're not putting it as a dependency. That's because that ESLint wants to remove any unexpected behaviors. It assumes that you want to always rerun this callback every single time that the count value changes. But sometimes there are some cases that you don't like necessarily want to rerun this logic whenever a state changes. You know, you just want to like read the state only once, or like let's say I want this to be dependent on something else. Let's say I want to say that whenever the to-dos got updated, then start rerunning the count in here. Well, of course it's going to have a very weird effect in this use case, but sometimes it's very useful, especially when you're dealing with multiple states and the state system is more complex. It's kinda irrelevant and it's not useful. So in this case, for example, because I'm saying that like the fetching the to-dos is dependent on the count to get refetched, then because of that I have the set to-dos being called, and then it re-renders again, and then these use effects understands that the to-dos got changed. So that's why it's, you know, like that, not the best idea to do. So I would say that you could safely ignore this if you like really know what you're doing. Because other than that, I wouldn't recommend not listening to this if you don't exactly know like why you're doing this, like why you're doing what you're doing. Yeah, I guess that wraps up this YouTube video. I hope you enjoyed it. I know it's not the best tutorial you've ever seen. It's my first attempt, but yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments, please feel free to add that. And yeah, and just like feel free to like and subscribe if you like the video and if you enjoy the content and channel. I'll see you in the next video.